The story begins in a small village, where a young girl named Heidi lives after the tragic deaths of her parents. She is taken in by her aunt Didi, who is young and works far from the village. Unable to take Heidi with her, Didi is left with no choice but to send her to live with her grandfather. Heidi's grandfather resides in a secluded house atop a mountain, known for his cruel and violent reputation. He is a bitter man, estranged from his own son, and his presence is disliked by the villagers. Despite this, Didi has no other option but to leave Heidi with him. When Didi and Heidi arrive at the grandfather's home, he refuses to take them in and attempts to send them away. Didi, however, insists and leaves Heidi in front of the house, assuring her that her grandfather won't harm her. As they leave, Heidi naively tells him that her aunt doesn't want her, and the grandfather, though irritated, eventually relents. He enters the house, leaving Heidi outside, where she calls after him until she becomes exhausted and falls asleep in the barn with the animals. The next day, the grandfather reluctantly offers Heidi some milk, but then takes her to the priest in town, suggesting that someone adopt her. The priest, impressed by Heidi's health and charm, decides to keep her temporarily while he finds a suitable family. During this time, the grandfather agrees to allow Heidi to stay with him. Upon hearing this, Heidi asks if she'll be sleeping in the barn again, and her grandfather assures her that she can sleep anywhere she likes. She explores the house, where she finds only a chair and a bed. Later, she finds a small ladder leading to a loft made of straw. She insists on sleeping there, and the grandfather agrees. Heidi soon befriends Peter, a local boy who tends to the sheep on the mountain. He leads her on daily adventures, showing her the beautiful landscapes of the mountains. Heidi is joyful and playful, and Peter, though mischievous, enjoys her company. He steals food from her bag one day, and they share it together. Heidi later jokes about the goats eating her food, which Peter dismisses, claiming it might have been a goat's doing. Peter teaches Heidi about the goats and their milk production, and she convinces him to stop beating the goats when they fight, as it causes a drop in milk. Heidi promises that she will bring him food every day if he treats the goats kindly. The two grow closer, and Heidi continues to find joy in her new life. However, the peace is disturbed when the grandfather plans to send Heidi away to be adopted by someone in the city. Peter is heartbroken at the thought of losing her, and Heidi's relationship with her grandfather deepens. She becomes fond of him, and the grandfather, noticing her affection, begins to soften toward her as well. The grandfather finally tells her that she is welcome to stay with him, a decision that fills Heidi with joy. They grow closer, and Heidi starts to feel more at home. Winter arrives, and although Heidi misses Peter, her grandfather creates a sled for her so they can enjoy the snowy slopes together. One day, Heidi's aunt, Didi, returns from the city and informs the grandfather that she has found a family willing to adopt Heidi. The family lives in a large house, and they want a companion for their daughter Clara, who is bedridden. Didi tries to convince Heidi that this is a better life for her, but Heidi, unwilling to leave her grandfather, insists she is happy where she is. After some persuasion, Didi convinces Heidi to leave. The two take a train to the new home, and Heidi looks back at the mountains and the house she's leaving behind. Meanwhile, Peter returns to the grandfather's house, only to learn that Heidi has left with her aunt. Distressed, the grandfather searches desperately for Heidi in the village, but the villagers mock him, remembering his reputation. When the grandfather learns that he has missed her, he returns home, heartbroken and lonely. Heidi arrives at the new house, where she is greeted by the family's nanny, who is startled by Heidi's appearance in boyish clothes and unkempt hair. The nanny informs the family that Heidi is not suitable for their daughter Clara, and the family's attitude toward Heidi becomes cold. Heidi's aunt, Didi, in turn tells the family that Heidi is not interested in staying with them, and that the decision is ultimately up to Heidi. Though initially upset, Heidi grows more distant from her aunt, who continues to insist that she is only acting in Heidi's best interest. In the meantime, Clara, the bedridden girl, begins to form a bond with Heidi. Despite the challenges, Heidi remains optimistic, and over time, Clara's family begins to accept Heidi, even though her heart is still tied to her grandfather and the mountains. After lunch, Clara, Heidi, and the nanny sit together at the table. The nanny explains the strict rules of the household, telling Heidi that she is forbidden from running, jumping, making loud noises, or moving freely within the house. She also warns Heidi not to speak to the servants without using the formal term, Your Excellency, and to only address them with orders. These rules upset Heidi greatly, and she feels overwhelmed to the point where she falls asleep. The following day, during breakfast, Heidi is unsure of how to use utensils and awkwardly drinks from her plate and eats with her hands. The nanny scolds her and insists she use a spoon. Clara, trying to help, teaches Heidi how to eat quietly, but Heidi struggles to adapt to the new way of life. Later, they walk around the palace, with Heidi pushing Clara's chair. They stop in front of a picture of Clara with her mother, where Clara is standing on her feet in the image. Heidi smiles, admiring her, but Clara sadly explains that after her mother's death, she became unable to stand due to her deep sorrow. She expresses how much she misses her mother and cries, touching Heidi deeply. Clara confides in Heidi that her friend Peter once told her that education was pointless, a belief that upsets the nanny greatly. The nanny argues with the teacher, requesting a new tutor for Heidi, and insists that Heidi must be taught to reach Clara's level of education. Heidi continues to struggle with the rigid household rules, yearning for the freedom of the mountains, where she could run and play without restriction. Whenever Heidi explores a new room in the palace, she tries to open the windows to glimpse the mountains and her grandfather's house, but the windows are tightly sealed. One day, she asks the head of the servants, Sebastian, to open the window for her. Sebastian, a kind-hearted man, is charmed by Heidi's simple and humble way of treating him. He sets up a chair for her so she can stand on it and peer out the window, but all she can see are rows of houses. Sebastian points to a distant church and tells Heidi that if she climbs to the top, she will be able to see the mountains. Determined, Heidi decides to go the next day. The following day, Heidi and Clara go on an outing, visiting the church and walking through the city markets. When they reach the church, Clara tells Heidi to wait for her while she stays behind. Heidi climbs to the highest point of the church tower, but is still unable to see the mountains. She calls out for her grandfather, deeply missing him and feeling homesick. Meanwhile, the nanny enters Clara's room, thinking she is asleep, but upon finding her gone, the servants begin searching the palace. Sebastian, concerned, leaves to find them. Heidi, sad from her failed attempt to see the mountains, descends from the church and, on her way home, runs into Sebastian. They return to the palace together, where the nanny scolds Heidi for disobeying her. Clara, however, defends Heidi, but the nanny insists that she is not responsible for raising the children and punishes Heidi by denying her food and forcing her to stand facing the wall as punishment. Frustrated, Heidi decides to leave the house and return to her grandfather, putting on her old clothes and packing her things. When the nanny asks where she is going, Heidi calmly responds that she is going to her grandfather. The nanny angrily refuses to let her leave and throws her bag on the floor, telling Heidi that she will never be allowed to leave the house. Seeing Heidi's determination, Clara becomes upset and cries, which deeply moves Heidi. Torn between her desire to leave and her love for Clara, Heidi decides to stay for Clara's sake. However, Clara's sadness only grows, feeling abandoned by everyone around her, especially since her father is often away. Clara finally apologizes to Heidi and promises not to let her go. She expresses her longing to enjoy their time together, and Heidi, in turn, reassures her that they will find happiness. When Clara's father and grandmother return from their trip, they are kind to Heidi, but the nanny complains about her lack of proper education, claiming that Heidi was used to living in the wilderness with animals and is unsuitable for a sophisticated environment like theirs. The grandmother suggests that Heidi be judged based on her actions rather than her past, and she visits Heidi before bed, telling her a story about the life of a shepherd. Heidi is so captivated by the story that she asks the grandmother to finish it. The grandmother hints that if Heidi learns to read, she will be able to discover the ending herself, motivating Heidi to improve her reading skills. That night, Heidi stays up late, determined to read. By morning, she has learned how to pronounce all the letters and words correctly. With Clara's help, Heidi prepares for her lessons, impressing both Clara and the teacher with her progress. The family applauds her, and Heidi feels proud of her achievements. As the days pass, the grandmother prepares to leave again, and Heidi grows increasingly homesick. She misses her grandfather and her old life, but she recognizes that Clara is happy to have her around. Clara's father decides to ignore Heidi's sadness for the sake of his daughter's joy. One night, a servant hears strange noises coming from the palace, and a door seemingly opens by itself. Fearing the presence of a ghost, she calls the nanny and Sebastian, and they grow anxious. The next morning, they report the incident to Clara's father, who dismisses the idea of ghosts, but asks the doctor to investigate. Later that night, they hear the door open again. As they investigate, they find that Heidi has been sleepwalking. The doctor realizes that Heidi's dream is about her grandfather and that she is deeply homesick. He informs Clara's father that Heidi's illness is due to her separation from her family and her longing for her home. The doctor, having warned Clara's father about Heidi's condition, leaves after a serious discussion. The father stays up all night, reflecting on the doctor's words and his mother's advice. After much contemplation, he decides that Heidi must return to her home. He sits down with Clara to explain the situation, telling her that Heidi needs to go back because she is ill from missing her home. Clara, devastated, has a hard time accepting the news and reacts by breaking things in frustration. When Heidi sees Clara, she becomes upset but tells her that she must go home to her grandfather. Clara orders her maid to take her back to her room. The father sits with Heidi, listening to her express her desire to return home. Heidi is overjoyed by the decision, but her thoughts linger on Clara. She goes to say goodbye to Clara, but Clara refuses to say goodbye. her heart filled with sorrow. Heidi travels back to her village with the head of the servants, who guides her through the journey. As Heidi arrives, the villagers are overjoyed to see her, now dressed in new clothes, looking beautiful and happy. Heidi immediately goes to Peter, who greets her with a warm hug. She then runs toward the mountains to reunite with her grandfather. As she climbs the mountains, she sheds the dress that had kept her confined, feeling liberated as she races across the open land. She calls out for her grandfather, and when he hears her voice, he cannot believe his ears. He rushes to her, tears of joy streaming down his face as they embrace. Heidi resumes her life with her grandfather and Peter, feeling fulfilled and happy in the mountains. One day, Heidi writes a letter to Clara, inviting her to visit. When Clara receives the letter, she is overwhelmed with sadness and longing for her friend. Her grandmother, seeing her distress, decides to take Clara to visit Heidi. Heidi, excited beyond measure, prepares for Clara's arrival. Her grandfather, sitting with Clara's grandfather, agrees to take care of Clara while she stays with Heidi, promising to carry her upstairs to Heidi's room every day. When Clara arrives, Heidi is overjoyed to have her stay with her. The two girls spend their days playing together, laughing and enjoying each other's company. However, Peter feels jealous and upset that Clara is taking his best friend away from him. In a moment of frustration, Peter decides to take revenge on Clara by destroying her wheelchair. He throws it off a hill and runs away. The next morning, when Clara's wheelchair is missing, everyone searches frantically, but it is nowhere to be found. The grandfather quickly realizes that Peter is the culprit and decides to take Clara on a long journey to find the wheelchair. As they walk through the mountains, Clara experiences the breathtaking beauty of the land Heidi had always talked about. It is on this journey that Clara begins to feel something strange in her legs. She senses a feeling she thought was long gone, and she attempts to move her toes. With a mix of disbelief and hope, Clara tries to stand, but the effort is too much, and she leans against a rock for support. From a distance, Heidi sees Clara and, excited, runs toward her. Peter, also realizing what's happening, calls out for Clara to keep going. After much effort, Clara finds herself standing and then taking her first steps. The entire day is spent working with Clara to help her stand and walk on her own, and the excitement is palpable. News of Clara's progress soon reaches her father and grandmother, who rush to the village. As they approach, they hear Clara's voice and, to their amazement, see her standing and walking toward them. Neither Clara's father nor her grandmother can believe their eyes, overwhelmed with emotion as they watch Clara take those first steps. They cry with joy, thanking Heidi for the love and care she brought to their daughter's heart. Heidi's role in Clara's recovery is acknowledged by the family, and Clara's father and grandmother express their deep gratitude to her. Clara is able to return to her normal life, free from the sadness she had felt since her mother's passing, and is filled with a new sense of joy and hope thanks to Heidi's presence in her life. Heidi, meanwhile, continues to live with her grandfather in the mountains. She enjoys her time in the village, attending school, and pursuing her love for storytelling. Inspired by her own life and experiences, Heidi writes her first novel, documenting the incredible journey of her life.